Hello everyone, let me ask you a question. What if I told you that the ultra-thin, nearly invisible fishing line you so carefully spooled onto your reel for this January trip is the main reason the fish are ignoring your bait? It sounds crazy, right? We've been taught for decades that in the dead of winter, thinner is always better. But today, we're going to challenge that sacred rule. I'm going to show you why that 0.1 millimeter line might be costing you fish, and how a small change in your setup could completely transform your winter fishing success. The reason has less to do with what the fish can see and more to do with something most anglers completely overlook. So what's the thinnest line you've ever used for ice fishing? Drop a comment below. I'm genuinely curious to see what you're all working with. Now let's be fair. The logic behind using a thin line in winter makes perfect sense on the surface. We've all heard it and we've all repeated it. The water in January is often crystal clear. The fish, like perch or crappie, are cold and their metabolism has slowed way down. They have all the time in the world to inspect your lure before deciding to bite. So the theory goes, you need a line that's practically invisible. You need that stealthy approach to avoid spooking them. This idea has been passed down from one generation of fishermen to the next. It has become such a fundamental rule that questioning it feels like saying you should fish with a bright red rope. Many of us have spent years chasing thinner and thinner lines, believing that each tiny step down in diameter was a step towards becoming a better winter angler. But we've been focusing so hard on one single variable, visibility, that we've forgotten about the bigger picture. Let's start by talking about the physics of plastic in the cold. Your fishing line, whether it's monofilament or fluorocarbon, is a type of plastic. And what happens to plastic when it gets really, really cold? It gets stiff, it gets brittle, it develops a powerful memory. Think about a garden hose left out in the frost. It becomes rigid and holds its coiled shape. Your fishing line does the exact same thing, just on a much smaller scale. This phenomenon is called line memory. In the warmth of summer, a good quality line will relax and become straight after coming off the spool. But in the freezing temperatures of January, that line fights to stay in the tight coils it had on your reel. This is the first and perhaps most critical flaw in the thinner is better argument. You might have an invisible line, but if it's acting like a tiny, wiry spring, you have a much bigger problem than visibility. Now picture the scene. You're hunched over your ice hole. You drop your tiny, lightweight tungsten jig, weighing maybe half a gram, down into the water. It's tied to your expensive, super thin 0.08 millimeter fluorocarbon line. You're feeling confident, thinking you have the ultimate stealth presentation. But here's what's actually happening down below. That stiff, cold line isn't hanging straight. It's a series of microcoils, a tiny, slinky stretching from your rod tip to your lure. The minuscule weight of your jig isn't enough to pull those coils out and make the line perfectly taut. So when you try to impart that subtle, lifelike action to your jig, what happens? Nothing. Your rod tip moves, but that motion is absorbed by the slack and memory in those first few feet of coiled line. The jig barely moves, or it moves in a jerky, unnatural way. The fish sees this and it's an immediate red flag. It's not a natural insect or minnow, it's something fake, something wrong. This leads us to a crucial point. Lure action trumps invisibility almost every single time in winter. A fish's decision to strike is often triggered by movement. The subtle flutter of a falling jig, the gentle pulse of a soft plastic, the tiny kick of a balanced minnow, these are the triggers. When your line is too thin and stiff from the cold, it kills that action. It acts like a rigid wire, preventing the lure from moving as it was designed to. Now consider the alternative. Imagine using a slightly thicker but much softer, high-quality monofilament line, say a 0.12 or even a 0.14 millimeter line. Yes, it's slightly more visible, but because it's softer and has less memory in the cold, it allows your jig to hang naturally and vertically. Every tiny twitch of your rod tip is transferred directly to the lure, making it dance and flutter enticingly. Which presentation do you think a sluggish perch is more likely to eat? The one that's stiff and dead, or the one that's alive and dancing? Let's dig a little deeper into the fluorocarbon myth. We buy it for one primary reason. It's nearly invisible in water because its refractive index is very close to that of water. This is true. However, fluorocarbon is also denser and inherently stiffer than monofilament. This stiffness is magnified exponentially by the cold. It becomes wiry. So while you gain an advantage in invisibility, you often sacrifice so much in terms of lure presentation that the trade-off isn't worth it, especially with very light jigs. I've seen it countless times. An angler is using the thinnest fluoro line they can find, and they're getting no bites. They see fish on their flasher, inspecting the lure and turning away. They blame the lure color, the bait, anything but the line. The real problem is that their lure is hanging at a weird angle, tethered by a stiff, coiled piece of plastic, and it looks completely unnatural to the fish. Monofilament, on the other hand, often gets a bad rap in winter. People think of it as the cheap, stretchy, highly visible option. But modern, high-quality monofilament designed for ice fishing is a completely different beast. It is engineered to remain soft and manageable even in sub-freezing temperatures. It has significantly less memory than fluorocarbon in the cold. This means it comes off the spool straighter, allowing for a much more natural presentation with lightweight lures. Yes, it is slightly more visible, but let's be realistic. A fish in 20 feet of water in the low light conditions under the ice and snow is not going to be spooked by the difference between a 0.1 millimeter and a 0.12 millimeter line. It will, however, be spooked by a lure that moves like a puppet on a string. The natural action you get from a softer line is a far greater advantage than the marginal gain in invisibility. Let's talk about a real-world scenario. Imagine you're fishing for finicky crappie. They are suspended 10 feet below the ice. You're using a tiny horizontal jig with a single maggot. This is the ultimate finesse situation. The classic wisdom says to use a 2-pound test or about a 0.12 millimeter fluorocarbon line. But I'm suggesting you try a 3-pound test, high-quality ice fishing monofilament instead, which might be around 0.14 millimeters. Why? Because the crappie bite can be incredibly subtle. They often inhale the bait and move upwards. You need to be able to detect that slight upward lift. A stiff, coiled fluorocarbon line will have slack and memory, which will completely mask that delicate upward lift bite. A softer, straighter monofilament line will transfer that subtle movement to your rod tip or spring bobber instantly, allowing you to set the hook. You will detect more bites, and therefore you will catch more fish. Another factor to consider is line weight versus lure weight. The thinner is better mantra completely ignores this crucial relationship. If you are using a heavier lure like a 1/4-ounce spoon or a rattling lure for walleye, then a thin line can actually work just fine. The weight of the lure is enough to pull out most of the line's memory and keep things taut. The problem arises when we apply that same logic to micro jigs and finesse presentations. A 1-gram jig simply does not have the mass to straighten a cold, wiry line. So the new rule shouldn't be thinner is always better. It should be use the thinnest line that allows your lure to perform naturally at the current temperature. And in the brutal cold of January, that line is often a step or two thicker than you think. Now let's think about the practical side of things. It's January. It's 10 degrees Fahrenheit outside and the wind is blowing. Your fingers are numb even inside your gloves. Trying to tie a knot in a wiry, hair-thin piece of fluorocarbon is a special kind of nightmare. The line is slippery, it wants to stay coiled, and it's nearly impossible to see. You spend 5 minutes fumbling with a knot, your hands get even colder, and you get frustrated. Then you finally get a bite, and the line snaps on the hook set because it became brittle in the cold or got nicked by the ice at the edge of the hole. A slightly thicker, softer monofilament line is infinitely more manageable in these conditions. It's easier to tie knots with, it's more durable, and it's less prone to an unexpected break-off. Fishing should be enjoyable, not a frustrating battle against your own equipment. We also need to discuss the issue of ice. Your line is constantly rubbing against the bottom edge of your ice hole. This edge can be razor sharp, especially if the ice is thick. A super thin line with a diameter of less than 1/10 of a millimeter has very little abrasion resistance. It only takes 1 or 2 good fish runs against that sharp edge to create a weak spot. A line that's just a couple of hundredths of a millimeter thicker, say a 0.14 millimeter line, can have almost double the abrasion resistance. When you hook into that surprise monster walleye or a big lake trout while fishing for perch, you'll be thankful for that extra bit of durability. Sacrificing that security just for the sake of supposed invisibility is a gamble that rarely pays off in the long run. Let's bust another myth that you can solve the memory problem by stretching your line. You'll hear guys say, "Oh, just pull off a bunch of line and stretch it out before you start fishing." While this might provide a temporary fix, it's actually damaging your line. When you stretch monofilament or fluorocarbon, you are permanently weakening its structure. You are reducing its knot strength and its overall breaking strength. You might get the coils out for a few minutes, but as soon as the line gets cold again, it will try to return to its memorized shape. And now you're fishing with a compromised, weaker line. A much better solution is to simply start with a line that is inherently softer and has less memory in the cold, even if it means going up 1 size in diameter. Don't try to fix a bad choice with a bad practice. Let's think about sensitivity. Many anglers choose fluorocarbon because they believe it's more sensitive due to its low stretch. In a perfect world, on a perfectly straight line, this is true. But we are not in a perfect world when we're ice fishing. We are in a world of coiled, stiff line. Those microcoils in a thin fluorocarbon line act as tiny shock absorbers. They introduce slack into the system. This slack completely negates any sensitivity advantage the material might have. A bite has to pull out all that slack before you even feel it. A thicker but softer and straighter monofilament line, while having more inherent stretch, provides a more direct connection to your lure. You will feel more, not less. The sensitivity argument for ultra-thin fluoro in the cold is a classic example of theory not matching reality. Let me tell you about a little experiment I did. I was out on a lake with a friend fishing for perch. The bite was slow. We were both using identical tungsten jigs. I was using a premium 0.1 millimeter fluorocarbon line. He was using a 0.14 millimeter ice-specific monofilament. According to all the old rules, I should have been out fishing him 10-1, but the opposite happened. He was consistently catching fish while I was getting nothing but lookers on my flasher. We swapped rods for half an hour. Suddenly, I started getting bites on his rod, and he couldn't get a touch on mine. The only difference was the line. His slightly thicker, softer line was allowing the jig to have a subtle, natural quiver. My invisible line was making my jig look dead and unnatural. That day completely changed my perspective. So, when is it okay to use a super thin line? There are exceptions, of course. If you are fishing in extremely shallow, gin-clear water, maybe only 2 or 3 feet deep, for highly pressured and extremely spooky fish. In that specific scenario, the visibility might become the #1 factor. Also, if you are fishing in a heated ice shack, where your line and reel are not being exposed to the brutal sub-freezing air temperatures, the line memory issue becomes less severe. But for the vast majority of us who are fishing in deeper water, out in the open, in the freezing cold of January, the drawbacks of an overly thin line far outweigh the perceived benefits of its invisibility. We need to adapt our strategy to the actual conditions we are facing, not to a rule we read in a magazine from 20 years ago. Consider water clarity as well. The crystal clear water assumption isn't always true. Many lakes and reservoirs have a bit of stain or suspended sediment, even in winter. Under a thick blanket of snow and ice, the light penetration is very low. In these common real-world conditions, the difference in visibility between a 0.1 and a 0.14 millimeter line is functionally zero. The fish simply cannot perceive that small a difference in those lighting conditions. So why are we making such a huge sacrifice in lure action and manageability for a benefit that doesn't even exist in many situations. It's like whispering in a rock concert. Nobody can hear you anyway, so you might as well speak up. Use the line that gives you the best presentation. Let's also talk about hook sets. When you set the hook with a very thin line, you have to be careful. The line has low shock strength and it's been made more brittle by the cold. A powerful hook set can snap it instantly. A slightly thicker line provides a bit of a safety cushion. It has more mass and is generally more durable, giving you more confidence to drive that hook home, especially when a fish bites aggressively. This is particularly important when you're using small jigs with small hooks. You need a solid hook set to penetrate the bony part of a fish's mouth. Being timid because you're afraid your line will break is a recipe for losing fish. That extra confidence that comes from a more robust line is a real, tangible advantage on the ice. Think about line twist. Lightweight jigs are notorious for spinning as they are lowered down the hole. A stiff, wiry line is highly susceptible to taking on this twist and holding it. After a few drops, your line becomes a tangled mess just below the water's surface. You spend more time untangling birds' nests with frozen fingers than you do fishing. A softer, more supple monofilament is much more resistant to this kind of line twist. It uncoils more easily and doesn't hold that twisted memory as badly. This means less frustration and more time with your bait in the strike zone. It's another one of those small, practical considerations that add up to a much better and more successful day on the ice. The best fishing line is the one you're not fighting with all day. Now, I am not saying you should go out and spool up your ice rods with 20-pound test-braided line. This is not about going to extremes. This is about nuance. It's about finding the sweet spot. The point is to stop blindly following the thinner is always better rule. Instead, start thinking critically about your specific situation. What is the water temperature? How much does my lure weigh? Is lure action or invisibility more important for this species? How manageable is this line with frozen hands? The answer, very often, will be to go up 1 or even 2 line sizes from what traditional wisdom dictates, especially when you choose a high-quality, soft, ice-specific monofilament over a wiry fluorocarbon. Let's create a new rule of thumb for January fishing. For micro jigs under 2 grams, start with a high-quality 0.12 or 0.14 millimeter ice mono. This gives you the best balance of low visibility and excellent natural lure action. For heavier spoons and lures, from 3 to 7 grams, a 0.16 to 0.18 millimeter line is perfectly fine and provides extra security. If you absolutely must use fluorocarbon, consider using it only as a short leader, maybe 2 to 3 feet long, tied to a more manageable monofilament main line. This gives you the supposed invisibility near the lure without filling your entire spool with a stiff, hard-to-manage line. This hybrid approach can be a great compromise. The next time you're respooling your ice fishing reels, I challenge you to do an experiment. Spool one rod with your usual ultra-thin fluorocarbon. Spool a second, identical rod with a high-quality ice monofilament that is 1 or 2 sizes thicker. Use the same lure on both. Fish with them side by side throughout the day. Pay close attention not just to how many bites you get, but to how the line feels, how it handles in the cold, and how your lure looks on your fish finder. I am willing to bet that by the end of the day you will be reaching for the rod with the slightly thicker, softer line far more often. The real-world results will speak for themselves, and you'll see that the old rule was made to be broken. Ultimately, confidence is one of the most important tools an angler has. If you are constantly worried about your line being too visible, or your knots being weak, or your line breaking on a big fish, you're not fishing effectively. You're hesitant. You're second-guessing yourself. Choosing a line that is manageable, reliable, and gives your lure the best possible action will boost your confidence. You'll fish harder, you'll be more focused, and you will catch more fish as a result. Sometimes the best technical advantage is simply having a setup that you trust completely, one that lets you forget about the gear, and focus entirely on the fish. And for January ice fishing, that setup often starts with a line that is just a little bit thicker. So, let's wrap this up. For years, we've been obsessed with the idea of invisible, ultra-thin fishing lines for winter. We thought we were being smart and stealthy. But the big twist, the aha moment, is that we were focusing on the wrong thing. We were so concerned with what the fish could see, we completely forgot about what the fish can feel and how it reacts to movement. The stiffness and memory of thin lines in the brutal January cold absolutely murders the subtle, lifelike action of our lures. And in the end, a natural presentation will always catch more fish than an invisible but dead one. This simple realization can fundamentally change your entire approach to ice fishing. It's not about throwing out the old knowledge entirely, but about understanding its limitations and knowing when to break the rules. Thank you so much for watching. If this video made you rethink your setup, do me a favor and hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe for more tips that go against the grain. Now I have a question for you all, and I want you to be honest. What's the one unbreakable fishing rule you've broken that led to an amazing day on the water? Share your story in the comments below. I can't wait to read them.